The ViewMate ultrasound console is a fully featured intracardiac echocardiography system designed for exceptional real-time image guidance and visualization of anatomic structures. The compact console delivers fast, high-fidelity imaging performance to assist clinicians performing complex electrophysiology and interventional procedures. The ZS3 ultrasound platform consists of two major components. 1. The cart, and 2. Transducers. The cart contains the software-driven imaging electronics and user interfaces. It houses the microprocessor, memory, amplifiers, and power supplies for the microprocessor. It sends electrical currents to and receives electrical impulses from the compatible transducers. The cart performs the calculations involved in processing the data to produce the displayed ultrasound images. The console contains an integrated battery pack that can power the system for up to 1.5 hours of normal use. The battery allows the system to be operated without connection to an active AC power outlet. The backup is automatically kept charged by the DC power suppliers within the system. The battery is charged as needed whenever the ZS3 system is connected to active AC power. This is the circuit breaker switch. When servicing the ZS3 system, always be sure to turn off the AC circuit breaker to remove all power from the unit. Otherwise, make sure to have the circuit breaker turned to the on position to ensure that the battery is charging. Press and release the power button to turn the system on. The system takes approximately 30 seconds to complete the normal power on sequence. Check the ZS3 display to ensure the Zenari startup screen is shown. When initialization is complete, the system is ready for imaging. The ZS3 features a full-sized 19-inch LCD display with monitor-mounted high-fidelity stereo speakers. The integrated front handle allows for quick vertical positioning and transport. The height of the user interface console can be adjusted by squeezing the release lever located inside the right front handle. The multi-transducer port, or MTP, allows up to 3 transducers to be simultaneously connected to the system. You can easily activate any of the transducers connected to the cart. The ViewMate ultrasound console is highly flexible and comes with multiple image modes and transducer options. The available transducers include the following: the P9-3IC transducer, or the ViewFlex Extra ICE catheter for intracardiac echocardiography, the P4-1C phased array transducer for transthoracic echocardiography, or TTE, the P8-3 phased array transducer for transesophageal echocardiography, or TEE, the L8-3 linear array transducer for vascular ultrasound imaging. To begin imaging, connect the selected transducer so that the cable is oriented upward. Rotate the connector locking knob clockwise to lock the connector into the port. For the ViewFlex Extra ICE catheter, there are 2 connections. You must connect the catheter interface module, or SIM, to the console port. Once the connector portion of the catheter is handed off from the sterile field, orient the short and long sections of the connector and plug the catheter connector into the catheter port. To select a transducer, on the keyboard press Transducer to display soft keys for each connected transducer. Then press the soft key for the desired transducer. If you would like to switch to a different transducer, simply reselect the Transducer button and press the soft key for the new desired transducer. To enter patient information for a new study, press New Patient. Enter patient information and select the exam and preset on this screen. Press Freeze to begin imaging. Begin scanning and acquire desired images and video. If you are in an emergency situation and need to start imaging right away, you can edit the patient information after the exam by selecting New Patient and making sure to not close the current exam. To collect images into the patient exam, there are 3 keys that can be configured to either print or store images: Store 1, Store 2, and Print. These can be configured to save and send images to an optional printer, hard drive, DICOM network device, or FTP site. These keys can be configured in System Setup, Archive, Store Print. Any of these keys can be configured for any subset of store print destinations. To review images in the current exam, press Current Exam on the back row of the keyboard. All stored images for the exam will appear. To view an image in large format, point with the cursor and press the Set key. Press Current Exam to exit review and return to live imaging. Once you are done imaging, make sure to properly end the exam by pressing the End Exam button on the keyboard. Then select Yes when the prompt asks if you are sure you want to end the exam. To export exams and the collected media files, connect your device to the corresponding media port on the front of the machine. To export exams, first press Archive on the back row of the keyboard. By default, this shows the list of exams present on the internal hard drive. From this screen, the exams can be viewed, copied, deleted, or exported. Point to the selected exam and press Set. Then click Export at the bottom of the screen. On the next screen, point to Destination. Next, select Options. On the Archive Exam Export Options screen display, select Non-DICOM and then select JPEG or TIFF. Remove the identification of the patient if using for a presentation. Click Apply. Click Export on the next screen and verify export by clicking Yes or No at the prompt. Non-DICOM images can be viewed on a computer and used for a presentation. DICOM images can only be viewed on a DICOM networked device, such as when storing images to a PAX server. Finally, to power off the system, press and release the power button. Thank you for viewing the ViewMate Ultrasound Console Quick Start video guide.
Do you know which Indian pharma company has consistently launched innovative first in India products? Presenting MCure Pharmaceuticals. With over 500 scientists, we are pioneers in chirality. We have been making a healthy difference to countless families. With cardiology at our heart, we have strived to give you better products always. Chiral products are complex to develop. They are difficult to manufacture, but their benefits make a difference. A difference for your patients, for you. We are proud to launch our latest chiral development, Exafib, our indigenously developed rivaroxaban. Developed in-house, manufactured at our state-of-the-art facility at Jammu. This is a WHO GMP certified facility. We conduct quality checks to ensure only the best is delivered. Exafib complements our chiral cardio portfolio. Exafib, committed to make a difference in anticoagulation therapy for your patients.
We are meeting for the second pre-conference workshop of the Digital IHRS 2021. After finishing the virtual IHRS last year, we had in mind to meet physically and do the IHRS of 2021 in person. And we harbored this perception for quite long, till almost June. And even today, it seems that going in person is a little difficult job. Some feel it's not impossible, and there are certain meetings happening in the country which are in person. But we decided to go digital, and the fruits of that are actually there to see. We have more than 2,500 registrations from India and world over. And look at the faculty that has agreed to be at the Digital IHRS 2021. More than 100 international faculty members, experts on different aspects of electrophysiology and heart failure. A similar number of national faculty drawn not only from reputed electrophysiologists of the country, but also from parallel specialties, ranging from heart failure specialists to even medical administrators. So that's the beauty of having a online meeting. And already after the pre-conference workshop of 13th, I have had messages saying that it was a wonderful session. Let me acknowledge the person who thought about this session. It is none other than our past president, Dr. Kalambur Narasimhan. Some of the topics somehow don't get discussed as vibrantly as they can be in a separate session. That was the thought behind this pre-conference workshop. And that's how we conceived that let's have 2 evenings dedicated to certain topics which can be discussed more at length than in the routine main conference sessions. So moving a little bit closer to the clinic, those who attended the meeting 2 days back saw that some of the giants in the field of experimental electrophysiology addressed us and discussed a couple of things with us. Today, we are getting a little closer to the clinical aspects of electrophysiology and heart failure, but not yet just stepping into the EP lab. For a good electrophysiologist, he should probably grow organically. What I mean is that there should be different aspects of management and therapeutics of arrhythmias and heart failure that he probably needs to understand. We do need to know the book indications of a particular management, but we also need to know what went behind reaching those recommendations and whether those treatments are suitable to our patients. Primum non nocere, first do no harm. We have a wonderful session about it to start with. Dr. John Mandrola will be addressing us on this topic of hyped up therapies avoiding resource limited settings. And I think in this country, there are a good number of followers on Twitter of Dr. John Mandrola. And personally, I was very happy when he agreed to address the Digital IHRS 2021. In the 10 minutes of discussion, I think we'll have a very vibrant discussion with Dr. Yash Lokhandwala, asking Mandrola some challenging questions probably. Once again, catching the same thread of we need to understand how those recommendations came and what statistics went behind it. We have Dr. David Chiang discussing with us the statistical aspects of reaching conclusions and making decisions. Dr. Chiang is from Melbourne, Australia, and he was a lead author on that particular paper of statistical considerations in interpreting EP studies. And once again, we have a most suitable moderator for that session, our past president, Dr. Anil Saxena. He loves those numbers and can make it simple for us. I'm sure we'll have a good discussion between the two. And then we have something more, which is about genetics. And for this talk, I've even gone ahead to invite pediatricians because this topic could have wide-ranging interests, not only among the EPs, but also among the pediatric cardiologists and pediatricians. So how do we do genetic testing? Which patients do we select? This field is quite nascent, I think, in our country. Very few practitioners into it. And therefore, the clinicians probably need to understand more about genetic testing as it applies to our field, which means inherited arrhythmias and cardiomyopathies. What are the opportunities? What are the challenges? And we know Dr. Talwar has done some work previously in this regard with cardiomyopathies. And once again, Dr. Talwar, I must introduce better as the IHRS patron, an eminent professor of All Indian Institute of Medical Sciences, very senior person, always easy to talk to and approach. And this time, he also willingly agreed to be our moderator. So once again, we hope to round up the session with a good discussion between Dr. Talwar and Professor Dr. Arthur Wilde. Professor Wilde is professor of genetics at the Amsterdam, and he has had a distinguished investigator award from the HRS to his credit, in addition to a big number of papers, a very respected authority. He's at Academic Medical Center in Amsterdam. He obliged us in the virtual IHRS 2020 by making a presentation. And once again, he did not disappoint us when we invited him to the digital IHRS 2021. So I don't want to stand too much in between the wonderful sessions that we are going to have this evening. But I'm going to invite our president, IHRS, Dr. Yash Lokhandwala, to say a few things why he thinks these topics are suited for discussion. Dr. Lokhandwala, please.
Thank you, Ashish. Am I audible?
Yes, very much.
Yeah. So this indeed is a session which is going to be thought-provoking, and I have in fact, requested several of my friends and colleagues to not miss this session. The topics are quite challenging, and Dr. Mandrola has always been a counterpoint, a thought. He stimulates your mind. He really takes apart some of the established concepts, and as you said, we have a lot of followers who read his articles. I have read several of them, and sometimes, I'm reminded of Shakespeare when he said, "The devil can cite scripture for his purpose." And Dr. Mandrola, I think, will probably some of his talk might be centered around how facts and how these things are doctored to suit your particular point of view. Dr. David, as you said, Ashish, at the cost of repetition, because for those who logged in a little late, I think statistics started off for us as the p-value, and then came the confidence intervals. And then we tried to sort of keep track on it for a while, but after a while, most of us clinicians just give up. We just give up reading the statistical methods in any paper because it's become too damn complicated. How can one decipher? How can one make sense out of it as a clinician? I think I'm sure Dr. David is going to make things simpler for us. And Professor Wilder, I've heard him several times, and every time he has come up with something new. He's in the sort of cutting edge of the field of genetics and channelopathies. And again, this is an area where we as clinicians are quite at sea. So I'm sure his talk also is going to be a step ahead in our understanding of this complex subject. So to kickstart this year's IHRS meeting, after day before's very basic session, I think this second session is really sets the platform for the meeting from day after. And I'm really looking forward to the next 1.5 hours. Ashish?
Sure. I think we have set the stage for the program to roll, and we are a little shade earlier than the schedule. I would probably ask Professor Talwar, Dr. Saxena, if they want to chip in with their thoughts on the construct of the today's evening's program before we start in 5 minutes from now. Professor Talwar, would you like to come in, please? I think he must be. Dr. Saxena, would you want to say a few words?
Sorry, Ashish. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, sure. You are on. You are on, please.
Thank you so much, Ashish, first for this opportunity. And I think you have chosen a subject which probably, as you already said it in the beginning stages with us. But I must share with you that as far as in the country, earlier, I think some years back, a publication was done from CCMB. Many centers were involved. And I think they found that our cardiomyopathies, like myosin binding protein C, was probably commoner kind of a genetic alteration as compared to the Western kind of data. I mean, so I think these are the new, and now there are a few studies going on in AIMS and some other institutions about both for the genetic studies in arrhythmia, cardiomyopathy, even for coronary heart disease. Let me share with you. I think you're right. It's a very nascent field for us, and very interesting to hear to Dr. Bilde on this aspect. And of course, we know the channelopathy, there are more data is available. But when we come to cardiomyopathy, I think we are still beginning to learn more about it, how these can help us in further planning our maybe therapeutic approaches. But anyway, I look forward to a really this very emerging kind of a area that I think in the field of medicine is coming up. Thank you, Ashish.
Thanks, Professor Talwar. Always a pleasure to listen to your thoughts. Dr. Saxena, would you like to say a few things?
Yeah, hi, Ashish. First of all, I would like to congratulate you on a wonderful program that you've designed. And today's topics are very special. The first two topics are somewhat interrelated. I'm sure Dr. Mandrola will also touch upon various statistical issues that are used currently, and some of the trials that are constructed or designed in a manner that many clinicians, they feel at a loss when we look at various methods of analyzing the trial data, and also the way the trials are designed in terms of the endpoints, the composite endpoints, multiple comparisons and all that. So I'm sure we will learn a lot today. And I think we are now reaching 8 p.m. Time. So I think we can start the program and I really look forward to these presentations today. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Saxena. I think all the three moderators have kind of set the stage to roll the session. Let me advise the backend if they can initiate the pre-recorded talk of Dr. Mandrola. Dr. Mandrola has joined us already, and I think Dr. Lokhandwala can discuss with him after the 20-minute talk. Can we roll the talk? Yeah.
By thanking the organizers for this invitation to talk. I really wish I could be there. I look forward to in-person meetings. My job in the next few minutes is to talk about critical appraisal of overhyped therapies. I have no disclosures. I'll start with AFib ablation. This is something that I do often. The first thing to mention is really our lack of understanding. Look at this slide. Do we really know what causes AFib? Multiple wavelet reentry or focal firing? And look at those dates, 1960, 1947. I think this is the core problem. With atrial tachycardia, we understand the mechanism. Ablation is successful. It's the same with ischemic ventricular tachycardia. Boom, we know the mechanism. But with atrial fibrillation, this is a slide I took from Stanley Nattel's review article. There's calcium handling abnormalities. There's structural remodeling. There's autonomic nerve remodeling and electrical remodeling. Ladies and gentlemen, here's the question. Where does one put a catheter to fix this problem? Now, let's talk about AFib ablation results and the seminal study from Bordeaux. Here in a small study of 45 patients, focal firing, everybody knows this study, 62% success rate. Now, this was in September 1998. Many years later, in 2013, here's a meta-analysis from Press Sanders Group, 19 studies, 6,000 plus patients, 3 years of follow-up. Again, 60% success rate. Let's fast forward to 2019, Cabana trial. In the best centers in the world, in an RCT where performance bias will be there, again, 50 to 60% success rate. What about hard outcomes? Well, let's go to Cabana. 2,200 patients, ablation versus antiarrhythmic drugs. I'm sure that most of you know the results. Hard outcomes, again, in the intention to treat analysis, no significant difference in drug therapy versus catheter ablation. And I highlight the y-axis because imagine if this Kaplan-Meier curve was on a 0 to 100% scale, you wouldn't be able to get a laser pointer through those outcome differences. Now, the tricky part of Cabana is that 9% of patients in the ablation arm didn't get ablation. 27% of patients in antiarrhythmic drug arm had ablation. And of course, as Dr. Packer said, you can't benefit from ablation if you don't get ablation. So if you look at the per protocol, yes, it was a statistically significant difference, and the treatment received looked even better. But here are the issues with the crossovers. Per protocol and as treated analysis basically convert an RCT to an observational study. You don't know if the crossover patients were similar. And in an open label trial, proponents, pro-ablation doctors may certainly have a biased selection of who gets crossed over. What's more, though, maybe more important, is that the investigators in Cabana powered the trial for crossover rates of 25 to 30%. So they expected these crossovers. And indeed, crossovers were not quite similar. If you looked at stayed with drug therapy versus crossed over to ablation, and I took this from the supplement, it definitely favors the ablation group. I mean, more healthier patients crossed over to ablation, sicker patients more likely stayed with the drugs. And again, same thing with persistent AFib versus long-standing persistent AFib favoring the ablation arm. Now, one of the things that we've done lately is we've moved, instead of this 30-second rule of recurrent AFib that's kind of overly strict, to measuring AF burden. AF ablation does better at reducing AFib burden, so we redefine success, so to speak. And here in the Circuit-Dose trial, which was a trial looking at contact force of RF versus two different ways of doing cryo, you can see that AF burden goes down quite a bit. But ladies and gentlemen, where's the control group? We don't really know what happens with no therapy or reassurance. And why is that important? Well, here's a really interesting study from a Northern European group looking at the natural history of atrial fibrillation detected by loop recorders. At least with loop recorders, 55% of all AFib had a reduced burden in the over time, and nearly 1 in 4, certainly 1 in 5 patients with AFib had spontaneous complete remission. This emphasizes the importance in a control arm. What about quality of life? Well, we all know that the Cabana study, also another paper, in fact, published in JAMA at the same time as the main Cabana paper, showed an improvement in quality of life with ablation. But look what happens over time. If you look over time, the differences between catheter ablation and drug therapy really are not that striking. But of course, the main problem with quality of life after AFib ablation is this. Ablation trials with a placebo sham control. And I left this slide blank because there are no trials with a placebo control. Here's a patient who exemplifies why we need such controls. This is a patient of mine, 62 years old. He's active at CrossFit. And this is an EKG recorded 1 year after 2 AFib ablations. I walk into the exam room and he says, "Dr. M, thank you. I now feel great." And everybody can see that he's in atrial fibrillation. This is not an outlier. Here's a sub-study of the STAR-AF trial, and I highlight this from the abstract. Quality of life after ablation improves regardless of procedural outcome. And here's another study from Dr. Verma's group in Canada. 50 patients who had AFib ablation and all had ILRs. They were blinded to their results, and the ratio of asymptomatic to symptomatic AFib increased after ablation from 1.1 to 3.7. Multivariate analysis of predictors of asymptomatic episodes after ablation, the number one was just being post-ablation. Of course, this is not anything that placebo researchers wouldn't tell you. Placebos are important because natural history changes, there's regression to the mean, there's the effect of co-interventions, there's psychobiological factors, all leading to clinical improvement. The summary: conclusive RCT data showing improvements in hard endpoints after ablation are still lacking. Improvement in quality of life post-AF ablation is common, but is not dependent on arrhythmia eradication. A strong placebo effect after ablation is going to be an obvious thing. And the history of cardiology, really medicine, is replete with therapies that were proven ineffective with proper controls. Let's move to appendage closure. This we can do fast. Start with the divergent results of the pivotal trials. Of course, the FDA said no to the PROTECT-AF, which was the first seminal trial. There were too high of procedural complications. There was overlap. 26% of the Watchman group were still on warfarin at 45 days. Watchman did not reduce ischemic stroke relative to warfarin. There were spuriously high rates of hemorrhagic stroke in the warfarin group. And all patients with ischemic stroke who had INR measured at the time of their stroke were subtherapeutic in the warfarin arm. Of course, this is the PREVAIL. FDA said do another trial. So here are the 5-year results of PREVAIL. You can see that the event rates on the co-primary late ischemic efficacy endpoint. This is excluding ischemic stroke after the first 7 days of randomization. Here, 2.2 times more ischemic stroke in the Watchman arm. And here, by rate difference, yes, it met non-inferiority. But look here, if you accept non-inferiority here, you have to accept a nearly 5-fold increased rate of ischemic stroke in the Watchman arm. Major bleeding. If you count all, include the procedure, there was no significant difference between Watchman and warfarin. Patients, of course, cannot exclude the periprocedural time. Device-related thrombosis. Here's a French survey showing of consecutive patients, 469 patients. Device-related thrombosis, 7.2%. And of course, the protectors against device-related thrombus is more antithrombotic meds, which is the opposite of what you want to do with Watchman. The safety of antiplatelet patients in older patients is certainly suspect. Averroes took patients with a reason not to use anticoagulation and randomized apixaban to aspirin. And look at these bleeding rates. 1.4, 1.2% apixaban versus aspirin. I really think this is underappreciated, that apixaban has an extremely favorable safety profile. BAFTA trial, again, elderly patients with AFib. Look at this, the difference between warfarin and aspirin in terms of major bleeding, no difference. And of course, there's procedural risks. I put together the results of the Watchman trials, and again, a procedural risk of 6%. So a patient starts with a 6% major complication rate before any potential future benefit. You might argue that we've done better, and I could show you studies that show that that is not the case, actually. So in summary, PROTECT did not pass the FDA. PREVAIL missed its non-inferiority endpoint in the first endpoint and barely made non-inferiority in the other. Procedural complications and bleeding issues are going to offset the net clinical benefit. DOACs, NOACs are certainly better than warfarin. There's even a dubious pathophysiologic basis for percutaneous occlusion. And I didn't mention it, but PROG 17 and the US NCDR registry did not persuade me. Let's talk about ICDs and non-ischemic cardiomyopathy. There's another area of controversy. Do we offer an ICD to a 75-year-old female with non-ischemic cardiomyopathy, narrow QRS, and an EF of 25%? Well, defibrillators are proven beneficial, but I would ask, for whom? Here's a slide with RCTs with only non-ischemic patients in which ICDs proved beneficial. You can see there are none. 2 small early trials, mortality trials in non-ischemics, no difference. The definite trial was enriched with patients with non-ischemic or with all non-ischemic cardiomyopathy, but these were sick patients. The actual EF, 21%, 2/3 of the patients had non-sustained VT. And again, it could not reach significance despite a sudden death reduction. The reduction in mortality did not reach statistical significance. Low event rates and guideline-directed medical therapy were likely reasons. SCUD-HEFT had a pre-specified subgroup analysis. You can see in the top here, ischemic cardiomyopathy, p-value is significant in terms of reduction, but over 1,200 patients with non-ischemic cardiomyopathy, and the benefit did not reach statistical significance. Now, should trials have a time limit? SCUD-HEFT enrolled in 2000. That's many years ago. We know that there's secular declines in event rates. There's better guideline-directed medical therapy. We have sacubitril, valsartan, MRAs, and CRT. And indeed, there are studies that show this. This is a paper from the heart failure investigators. 40,000 patients enrolled in 12 RCTs from 95 to 2014. And look what happens. There's been a 44% decline in the rate of sudden death across these trials. The incidence of sudden death in the early period after randomization, 2.4% in the earliest trial, 1.0 in the most recent trial. So the risk of sudden death is going down, therefore the incremental benefit of ICDs is reduced. The Danish trial randomized 1,100 patients, long follow-up. These were sick patients, but guideline-directed medical therapy was excellent, and nearly 2/3 had a CRT, no significant difference in mortality. Now, if you look at this subgroup by age, under age 59, it looked beneficial. But remember, if you're going to posit beneficial effects in the young and there's no overall difference, then older patients may in fact do worse. But again, subgroup analysis in trials with a non-significant primary endpoint are problematic. So I would answer that we should not offer. There's no evidence that it's beneficial, and I would answer the initial question is no. Final topic is about the subcutaneous ICD. Now the SICD is a pretty hot commodity in the US. It's used and I think overhyped. And the question, of course, is it adequate replacement for the standard transvenous ICD? And you might wonder, how did the SICD get approved? Was it an outcomes trial? Well, no, it wasn't an outcome trial. It was DFT testing in 78 patients, a non-controlled European study of 55 patients, and a non-controlled follow-up of 304 patients, including short-term VT termination endpoints. And of course, in that paper, 13% of patients with an SICD received an inappropriate shock. The review article from 2016, two pretty famous authors, although these findings, the DFTs, suggest that the SICD may be clinically effective, DFT testing does not necessarily correlate with real-world efficacy. These authors cited the Praetorian trial, which we'll go into in a few minutes. Before I do that, I want to show you this paper. This is a study from Germany, 25 patients who presented with an SICD for generator change. And what they found was striking. In 5 of the 25 patients, 20%, induced VF was not successfully terminated after the first or second 65 joule shock, requiring a rescue shock. So, in other words, 1 in 5 patients with an SICD were walking around without adequate protection against sudden death. So let's talk about Praetorian. This was an SICD versus transvenous RCT, 850 patients. The primary endpoint was a combination of device complications or inappropriate shocks. And I'll discuss the non-inferiority results in critical appraisal. Of course, non-inferiority is a way we accept a new treatment if it could be even a little worse than the control. We pick the non-inferiority margin, but that is because the treatment has other benefits, like it's less expensive or less invasive or easier. This is a slide depicting all of the different outcomes that can occur in a non-inferiority trial. And the non-inferiority margin in Praetorian was 1.45. In other words, we'll accept that the SICD was non-inferior to the transvenous ICD if at most there was 45% more device-related complications or inappropriate shocks. And indeed, that's what the results showed. That the results were about the same. The upper bound of the hazard ratio, 1.39, so that met non-inferiority. And I'll go over the endpoints in more detail. So here, Praetorian was non-inferior and not superior because the hazard ratio upper bound didn't reach the non-inferiority margin. Now, the results went different ways. The device-related complications favored the SICD. The inappropriate shocks favored the transvenous ICD. And there's some important things in the details here. So for inappropriate shocks, here's how they laid out. And it was mostly cardiac oversensing that drove the higher rate in the sub-Q ICD arm. But here's an interesting finding. For appropriate shock therapy, a ventricular tachycardia, which was double counted, that was below the therapy zone, was counted as an appropriate shock. So a VT at, say, 150 beats per minute was counted as 300, and it was shocked, and that was counted as appropriate. Now, we know that randomized controlled trials that reduce shocks improve mortality. This is the MADE IT RIT study, which showed that permissive programming that reduced any therapy, appropriate or inappropriate, lowered overall death rates. And indeed, the original Praetorian protocol said that an inappropriate shock therapy for anything else but VFib or VT of more than 180, So to be an appropriate VT shock, it had to be high rate. But then somewhere, we're not sure where, that protocol was changed and inappropriate shock was for anything else but ventricular fibrillation or VT. So now remember, the non-inferiority margin was 1.45. And so 1.39 is kind of close to 1.45. And if you look at the primary composite endpoint here, 68 endpoint events, here, there are 6 more events in the SICD arm would make this trial no longer non-inferior. And indeed, if even 6 of these 11 oversensed VTs at lower rates were deemed inappropriate, then the trial would not have met non-inferiority. Now, that would have been non-inferiority not met. We wrote a letter, got it published in the New England Journal outlining this. Now, should shocks for double-counted slower VT be considered appropriate? You could say, well, it's VT. It was good that it was shocked. Well, we should ask the investigators, SICD investigators. Now, this is the untouched registry published in Circulation in 2020. Some of the authors are on the Praetorian paper. And in this paper, causes of inappropriate shock, look here. Anything oversensing, T-wave oversensing, was deemed an inappropriate shock. But in Praetorian, these were deemed appropriate shocks. That's interesting. Now, what about the non-inferior endpoint in Praetorian? Now, remember, non-inferiority trial, we accept that a new treatment could be a little worse than control because it has other benefits, like less expensive, less invasive, or easier. William McIntyre from Canada also had a New England Journal correspondence at the same time our letter was published, and here, the combination of 2 outcomes that trend in opposite directions for the SICD and transvenous ICD decreases the between-group differences and increase the likelihood of finding non-inferior. Basically, they're going in different directions. If you include events that you expect to trend in opposite directions, you bias towards the null, and if you bias towards the null, you make non-inferiority easier to reach. So in summary, there is a theoretical advantage of not having transvenous leads, especially in the young. That's true. But the SICD was approved with a surrogate measure of a DFT. There are no outcomes trials. There's a very debatable design of non-inferiority in Praetorian. I think there's extremely dubious adjudication of endpoints. And of course, if oversensed VTs were counted as inappropriate like they did in the untouched registry, the trial would not have met non-inferiority. Now, transvenous ICDs work. They've stood this test of time. And I'm not sure there is enough data to use this device to prevent death. And so with that, I'll close. And I thank you very much for your invitation.
Thank you, Dr. Mandrola. Are you there with us right now for taking some discussion?
Yep, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, I do. So I want to raise certain points in relation to your talk and a couple unrelated. Now, as I believe that in general, AFib ablation has in general become a class 1 indication for paroxysmal as well as persistent AF, has become a class 1 indication even ahead of drug therapy. And one of the important basis for making it class 1 is trials like Castle and Cabana. Now, I had reviewed these a few years ago for a national conference, and I had found a lot of loopholes in these trials. You also have pointed out these trials, but yet these trials have formed the basis of, is it true that they are one of the basis of making this a class 1 indication, AF ablation?
Well, hold on. I just put in my earpods. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I'm here working. I think that I don't think Cabana changed my practice very much because, it clearly didn't reduce hard outcomes. It's an unblinded study, so it's difficult to know about quality of life. And I think I reserve AFib ablation for patients who remain symptomatic after attempts at risk factor management, and after giving it time, and after maybe a trial of drug therapy. And so I really don't go to AFib ablation very quickly, but I do use AFib ablation. But I am a reluctant AFib ablator because I really wonder. We still don't understand AFib, and so I still wonder about how history will view AFib ablation.
Yeah. So my other question was that AFib ablation, most of the, if I talk about ablation for SVT, ablation for even atrial flutter, ablation for idiopathic VT, it's been fairly standardized for the last 2 decades. AFib ablation seems a free for all. Everyone does the technique they want, and there is just no standardization after 20 years of AFib ablation. So what's your comment on that?
Well, it is quite amazing that I go back to that slide that I showed where, we're still arguing about mechanisms. If you go to a conference, any AFib conference, and people stand up there, especially if you're talking about persistent AFib, there'll be as many approaches to persistent AFib as there are panelists. And I think that's because really nobody understands the mechanisms of AFib. I mean, WPW, we know what to do. We just ablate the pathway. And I think for paroxysmal AFib, we're all pretty sure that PVI alone is certainly the most common. But for persistent AFib, we just don't understand it, and that's why there's so much variability. And I don't know that that's it's changed. It hasn't changed one iota from when I started practice years ago. So it's just a deficit of knowledge of pathophysiology.
Yeah, I think Dr. Kerkar has joined. Would you shall we ask him if he wants to ask something on this?
Sure.
Dr. Kerkar is the organizing secretary of the president of the Digital IHRS 2021, and he has a great interest in the statistics as well as these kind of controversial indications, whether they should be much in practice. Dr. Kerkar, would you want to ask something? No.
I think while Praful Kerkar logs on, I think we have a couple of more minutes yet. So Dr. Mangola,
I couldn't get my audio.
Come in. Yeah.
Yes. John, your take on LA appendage closure. What percentage of your practice do you send patients for LA appendage closure? And if so, when?
0.
0? Thanks.
0.
I happen to be also an interventional cardiologist. What about an ASD patient who has got a large open atrial septal defect, elderly, who's got an ASD in place, and he's a perfect candidate to close that ASD? And at that point in time, why wouldn't one want to just go and close the appendage and then close the ASD? Your take on that, irrespective of his tolerance or otherwise to the anticoagulant on board?
My feeling about left atrial appendage closure is that I would refer patients. If there was a trial that I had access to. I still think we need better data for this, and I am not convinced at all that putting a foreign body in the left atrium is going to be beneficial. I am very much impressed by and moved by the LEOS 3 trial with external, surgical closure at the time of heart surgery. I mean, that data is clear but I am very, very skeptical that putting a percutaneous body in the left atrium is going to improve stroke. In fact, every observational study that comes out, device-related thrombus, higher complication rates in diabetics or in women and in chronic kidney disease, it further convinces me that this procedure probably is not going to be borne out. But look, I'm an outlier. It's a very hot procedure in the U.S., but I think the data is very dubious.
Okay, thanks.
Dr. Mandrola, I am sure that we would, in fact, like to grill you on many other aspects. But Ashish, I think we are
Yes.
Exactly,
Yes.
sir. One last comment, actually, Dr. Mandrola, I always thought, and I was also considered an outlier. I still am in some of these things. And maybe people think I'm too old and not keeping up with the times. But I thought that the LA appendage occluder is a device in search of a disease. So with those biased comments of mine, I think we can go on to the next talk.
Thanks.
Excellent.
Wonderful.
Thanks.
Great.
Hey,
great.
thanks for inviting me. It's my first talk in India, so I'm really grateful.
Yes, you wrote the same in the email, and maybe one day we get you here in person. Maybe next year.
Would love to. All right. Take care.
Great pleasure to have you here, Dr. Mandrola. Thanks, Dr.
Thank you. All right.
Right. So from one set of doubting Thomases, we move to the another set of doubting Thomases. And this time it is Dr. David Chiang from Melbourne, Australia. And Dr. Anil Saxena will once again moderate and explain to us why we need to doubt. I guess both the speaker and the moderator will be on the same page when the discussion happens. So let's play out Dr. David Chiang.
Hi, I'm David Chiang, cardiologist and PhD fellow at the Yarford Hospital in Melbourne, Australia. I would like to thank the Digital IHRS for the opportunity to present at this conference. The aim of this presentation is to provide an overview of statistical issues that EP clinicians should consider. And I hope that clinicians will be able to have a better understanding of how to design and interpret findings from clinical studies. And what I think is interesting about this presentation is that I'll be illustrating concepts using currently known AF ablation studies. These are the topics that I'll be discussing today. Firstly, a comparison of observational versus randomized control studies. Then I'll cover different types of study designs, sample size calculations, different types of study endpoints, intention to treat analysis versus other supplementary analysis. And lastly, a discussion about the currently used primary endpoint in most AF ablation studies. Observational studies in atrial fibrillation, including case control studies or cohort studies, allow for associations between treatments and outcomes to be assessed within a relatively short time period at a lower cost compared with randomized control studies. Observational studies can be useful for first evaluating a novel treatment, such as a new technology or technique. However, they are potentially subject to confounding and bias. A randomized control study accounts for these inherent weaknesses through the random assignment of patients to treatment groups, and any observed differences can then be attributed to the treatment allocations. A randomized control study therefore provides the highest quality of medical evidence and has the most significant impact on guideline recommendations. However, randomized controlled studies are expensive, resource intensive, and in general take longer to complete. Randomized control studies have been important in the quest to identify additional ablations beyond primary vein isolation to improve outcomes in AF patients. And as shown in the examples here, earlier observational studies in the persistent AF population have reported better outcomes with additional substrate modification, including complex fractionated atrial electrogram or cafe ablation and linear ablation in these patients. These observational studies are obviously very important to generate hypotheses, but they should be tested in the setting of a randomized control study. And as most of you are aware, the STAR-AF2 study was published in 2015. And in this study, 589 patients with persistent AF undergoing their first ablation procedure were randomized in a 1:4:4 ratio to primary vein isolation alone versus primary vein isolation with cafe ablation and primary vein isolation with linear ablation. The primary endpoint was freedom from atrial fibrillation recurrence, and the study indeed failed to show superiority of adding linear or cafe ablation beyond primary vein isolation alone, with a p-value of 0.15. And as a consequence of STAR-AF2, I think it is arguable that there was a change in practice with these add-on strategies largely abandoned for persistent AF patients undergoing first-time ablation. And similarly, multi-center randomized trials investigating stepwise ablation approaches incorporating cafe and linear ablations, as well as posterior wall isolation, have also failed to demonstrate significant benefit beyond primary vein isolation alone. Moving on to study designs now. There are three main study types, namely superiority, non-inferiority, and equivalence studies. I will only be talking about superiority and non-inferiority studies here. A superiority study is aimed at showing that a treatment or intervention is better than the current standard in relation to an outcome. The difference between the novel and standard treatment is derived or estimated along with a 95% confidence interval. And if the lower bound of the confidence interval is above 0, then superiority is shown. And I've included examples here of superiority studies in AF ablation, such as the MANTRA PAF in paroxysmal AF, T-top in persistent AF, and STOP AF in cryoablation. And this study showed that primary vein isolation is more effective than pharmacotherapy in treating AF patients. A non-inferiority study is mainly used in evaluating a novel therapy, which is expected to be safer or easier to use, or perhaps less expensive than the currently accepted standard treatment, but not necessarily expected to be more effective. In these studies, a non-inferiority margin needs to be defined in terms of the difference between the novel and the standard treatment groups. And this margin can be considered as the maximum acceptable clinical difference or loss in relation to using this novel treatment. And this margin is usually determined based on prior clinical findings, and there are several statistical methods that can be used to derive the exact value, such as the fixed margin method. And if the lower bound of the confidence interval lies above this non-inferiority margin, then non-inferiority is established. And an example of a non-inferiority study was the Fire and Ice study. In this study, cryoballoon ablation was compared with RF ablation to look for evidence of non-inferiority. The margin was pre-specified as a hazard ratio of 1.43. With regards to the primary endpoint, the event rates are very similar across both groups, with a hazard ratio of 0.96 and a lower bound of the confidence interval at 1.22, which was above the pre-specified margin of 1.43. And as such, cryoballoon was shown in this study to be non-inferior in relation to RF ablation. In this graph here, I've included study findings that were consistent with superiority or non-inferiority results. This x-axis refers to the treatment difference or treatment effect, and to the right, it implies that the new treatment is better, whereas to the left, it implies that the control is better, whereas the 0 refers to the neutral point where there's no treatment difference. In the top half of the graph, the lower bound of the confidence interval was above 0, which means that superiority was shown. In the bottom part of the graph, as the lower bound of the confidence interval was above the pre-specified non-inferiority margin, this means that non-inferiority is demonstrated. This graph here shows study findings that were inconsistent with superiority or non-inferiority. And in the top part of the graph, because the confidence interval intersects 0, superiority was not demonstrated. And similarly, because here in the bottom part of the graph, because the confidence interval intersects the non-inferiority margin, or as in this bottommost case here, as the confidence interval is entirely beneath the non-inferiority margin, non-inferiority is not demonstrated. Now, given that clinical studies can take a long time to conduct, an option is to use an adaptive study design, such as a group sequential design. And this enables studies to be stopped early if the interim analysis provides sufficient evidence for either efficacy of one treatment over the other, or no treatment difference at all, or in other words, futility. To do this, both the efficacy and the futility boundaries need to be pre-specified. And an important consideration here is that this interim analysis may not be statistically independent of each other. And there are several ways of conducting this group sequential analysis, and I've included some examples here. So if you look at the first one, if an endpoint is proven to be effective in one interim analysis, this can be potentially carried across to the next analysis, and with the focus on the subsequent analysis being placed on endpoints that have previously been shown to be negative. An example of a group sequential study is the CASTLE AF trial. And in this study, ablation was compared with medical therapy in AF patients who have concomitant heart failure. And the primary endpoint was a composite of death from any cause or hospitalization for heart failure. In this study, a 3-stage adaptive group sequential design was used. And the timing of the interim analysis was based on a predefined number of primary endpoint events that needs to be achieved. So the study had enough events to do the first interim analysis, but the study was stopped after 8 years due to slow recruitment and also lower than expected events. There were 133 events at the final count, but nonetheless, the primary endpoint was still shown to be significantly lower in the ablation group. Moving on now to sample size calculation. As you are probably aware, by convention, the null hypothesis is assumed to be correct. That is, there's no difference between the two treatments being compared. And evidence is sought against that in order to reject the null hypothesis. There are several things to consider when calculating or determining sample size. Firstly, the estimated treatment effect size, which is expressed as a difference in means for continuous variables or difference in proportions for categorical variables. And all things being equal, the smaller the effect size, the larger the sample size that is required. Secondly, variability of the treatment outcome needs to be considered, but this is only applicable for continuous variables and is usually expressed using the standard deviation. Type 1 error refers to a situation where the null hypothesis is incorrectly rejected when a treatment effect does not actually exist. And the probability of committing this type 1 error is known as alpha. And for sample size calculations is usually set at 5%, otherwise known as the significance level. Type 2 error refers to the situation where the null hypothesis is incorrectly accepted when a treatment effect does actually exist. And the probability of committing this type 2 error is known as beta. And the power of a study is represented statistically as 1 minus beta. And again, all things being equal, the larger the power needed, the larger the sample size that is required. Power is usually set at 80 to 90%. I've included some examples here of ablation studies that use 80% for their study power. Finally, we also need to account for potential loss of follow-up by incorporating dropout rates, and this is usually set at 10%. Endpoint selection is important as it affects sample size, and usually a single primary endpoint is used. However, other variations do exist, including multiple primary endpoints, in which at least 2 endpoints are considered together, but only one of them needs to be statistically significant. Choosing multiple endpoints increases the likelihood of picking up a treatment effect. However, this approach also runs the risk of falsely identifying treatment effects when they do not exist. And this is due to repeated hypothesis testing. And if multiple primary endpoints was to be utilized, we need to carefully consider adjusting for this repeated hypothesis testing, in particular the significance levels. And there are several methods for doing this, such as the Bonferroni or the Holmes method. And for example, in the Bonferroni procedure, the alpha level is divided equally among the different endpoints. I've included this example here, the alcohol AF study by my colleague, Dr. Bosco Bornik, where AF patients were randomized to alcohol abstinence or usual alcohol consumption, and 2 primary endpoints were used, namely freedom from AF recurrence and AF burden. And in this study, Bonferroni adjustment was used for these 2 endpoints, where the alpha level was divided to 0.05 for each endpoint. With multiple core primary endpoints, all defined endpoints must be statistically significant together. And the risk of using this core primary endpoint is that there's a chance that you might miss a genuine treatment effect, as if you include a lot of endpoints together. And in addition to that, the correlation between endpoints is important too, as the risk of falsely identifying a treatment effect increases as your correlation increases. Conversely, the risk of missing a treatment effect increases as your correlation decreases. In general, from a sample size point of view, it tends to be larger if you have very low endpoint correlation. Lastly, composite primary endpoint is used when a single endpoint has a very low event rate, in particular death. If death was used as a single primary endpoint, this will result in very unrealistic sample sizes. In the Cabana study, a composite endpoint was used, as shown here. However, we need to exercise caution in terms of interpreting the findings of composite endpoints, because the clinical importance of each endpoint may not necessarily be equal to each other. I would like to talk at this moment about the primary endpoint that has been used in most AF ablation studies, namely freedom from any atrial arrhythmia of more than 30 seconds after a blanking period. More recently, I think there's been a drive to consider AF burden as a more meaningful primary endpoint. And this is because of several reasons. Firstly, 30 seconds of AF recurrence is not actually based on any solid scientific evidence. And secondly, if brief and infrequent AF recurrence is to be considered a treatment failure, then I think this underestimates the benefit of ablation to the patient, particularly in those who have a history of persistent AF. And I'll show you the example here, the circa dose AF study by Jason Andrade. This was a 3-arm randomized study comparing RF ablation versus cryoablation in paroxysmal AF patients. And in all 3 arms, there was a significant reduction in AF ablation in excess of 98%. But if you look at 1-year freedom from any arrhythmia recurrence of more than 30 seconds, there's only 50%. So is the success of ablation here 98% or 50%? I think this information is important when we discuss about the option and the benefits of AF ablation with patients. And certainly the authors have mentioned in their study that using freedom from AF truly underestimates the benefit or the success of AF ablation. However, there are several challenges that needs to be overcome before we can use burden as a primary endpoint. In particular, we need intensive rhythm monitoring to do this. Now, earlier studies had obviously used Holter recordings, which is clearly insufficient for burden calculation. The gold standard is obviously a loop recorder or a pre-existing implantable cardiac device, but this is expensive and impractical for research patients. The solution could potentially lie in newer generation of non-invasive monitoring options, such as I've shown here, the ZyroPatch monitor or the AliveCore cardiac device, which helps to provide long-term and frequent intermittent surveillance. Another issue is the accepted definition for AF recurrence, particularly in the setting of continuous monitoring. If you look at studies utilizing loop recorders, there's a lack of consistency in terms of the definition of recurrence, and it ranges anywhere from 30 seconds to 2 minutes. Thirdly, how much AF burden needs to be reduced for a therapy to be considered successful? In the consensus document, 75% reduction has been proposed. Again, this is not based on any solid scientific evidence. Moving on to study analysis, intention to treat is the gold standard, where analysis of treatment groups is done as per the original allocated randomization. The advantages of intention to treat is that it preserves the integrity of randomization and it provides an unbiased assessment of efficacy. It also preserves the study sample size. However, the disadvantage to using intention to treat is that the treatment effect could be diluted or altered with protocol violation. And I think it's useful to also report on supplementary analysis to provide further insights into treatment outcomes. Treatment received refers to the actual treatment received, whereas per protocol analysis only includes those who comply with the randomization, and it excludes patients who did not actually receive the assigned treatment. And confidence in study results is often increased when the intention to treat analysis and the supplementary analysis yield very similar outcomes. This graph here illustrates difference between intention to treat per protocol as well as treatment received analysis. So here we have patients randomized to intervention, known as A, and control, known as B. In the intervention group, the majority of them will be expected to receive the intervention, known as A1, although a minority will be expected to not receive the intervention. Similarly, in the control group, the majority of them will be expected to remain the control group, although a minority of them will be expected to cross over into the intervention. If you look at intention to treat analysis, you're comparing patients based on their original randomization allocation. So in this case, A versus B. If you look at treatment received, you're comparing those in the intervention group who actually receive treatment versus those in the control group that cross over to receive intervention. So A1 plus A2, and you compare that to those in the control group who remain in the control group, combined with those in the intervention group who did not receive intervention. So B1 plus B2. In per protocol analysis, you only look at patients who complied with their original randomization. So you have A1 from the intervention group being compared to B1 in the control group. Now, I'd like to talk about the Cabana study because this was an important large randomized study comparing medical treatment versus catheter ablation. Using the intention to treat analysis, there was no difference in terms of the primary endpoint of death, disabling stroke, serious bleeding, or cardiac arrest. However, it is important to remember that there was a 27.5% crossover rate from medical therapy to ablation group. So in fact, if you look at the per protocol analysis at 12 months, there was a significant reduction in the event rates in the ablation group. And similarly, in the treatment received analysis, if you look at the primary endpoint or the individual endpoints of all-cause mortality or death or cardiovascular hospitalization, these were all in favor of the ablation group. So from my perspective, I think it's reasonable to say that the treatment effect in the intention to treat analysis has been significantly attenuated by the high crossover rates. I think one of the lessons from Cabana for me personally is that when we design a study, we need to incorporate treatment viability and also patient uptake when we design studies. So to conclude, an understanding of relevant statistical concepts is important to an EP clinician in order to interpret literature before changing practice. This presentation here, I have provided an outline of various considerations important in the design and the interpretation of AF ablation studies, including randomization, study design, sample sizing, and also the use of statistical tools for analysis. I think non-randomized studies can only be hypothesis generating, but it should not change routine practice until being subjected to randomized comparisons. And lastly, AF burden may be a more meaningful outcome to be measured in AF ablation studies. However, it does require continuous monitoring, which I think can be achieved through newer generation of monitoring technology. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. David, for an excellent presentation. I must compliment you. Got so many things clarified. Now, I completely agree with you that there are so many trials these days using composite endpoints. And often it happens that the less important endpoints, because they are more in number, they kind of start dictating the outcome of the trial, while the more important may be unfavorable. So that's a major point. Coming back to the Cabana trial, as you pointed out, there are three methods of analysis, and all three were applied in Cabana. The intention to treat, there were too many crossovers, reducing the quality of evidence. And in the per protocol, there was too much censoring because a lot of data was not considered for analysis, although it maintained randomization. And in the third one, that is as treated, randomization gets lost. So that again lowers the quality of evidence. So which of them is, like in your opinion, the best to consider, per protocol or intention to treat?
Well, thanks again for inviting me to be a part of this. I think with Cabana and looking at the results, I think personally what I would do is I would definitely consider, all the analysis outcomes together. I think it's important to have a look at intention to treat on the basis that it provides, an unbiased assessment of the treatment outcome. So I'll definitely look into that first, because that's usually the primary sort of analysis being conducted, and then looking at the supplementary analysis and making comparisons and trying to infer sort of the interpretation out of that. I think personally for me, I think it's important to consider all three of them together and to use that to sort of frame decision making when we discuss about the benefits of ablation for atrial fibrillation for patients. So I don't think it's going to be like picking one specific analysis in terms of interpreting the findings from Cabana. I think we have to consider all of them together. But I think certainly the high crossover rates, it does sort of confound the interpretation of Cabana to an extent. So I think my answer to that would be, I think all has to be considered. I think they all have their own specific advantages and disadvantages.
It's actually very relevant for electrophysiology because some of the procedures are very complex. And when you do intention to treat trial, there are too many crossovers because the trials take very long to complete and they were expensive, a lot of resources are consumed. And when there is too much crossover, then the data becomes less meaningful. Now, coming to a more basic question about hypothesis testing, there is a view that medical community has placed too much emphasis on the p-value threshold of 0.05 for a very long time. And there was like a paper by American Statistical Association that we should look at this threshold. And we should also look at other factors, like, for example, the context of a particular trial, whether there is any therapy which is available for that particular disease that is being investigated, the rigorousness of the trial being conducted, and all these factors are equally important. Sometimes we reject very important therapy just because it missed the threshold of 0.05 narrowly. And otherwise, like as Dr. Mandrola pointed out, a lot of therapies, they get accepted because it meets the threshold of 0.05, even though the survival curve looks very similar. And if you show those survival curves to patients, they will not be very impressed. So what are your views about that?
Yeah, I agree. The p-value is something that you see being reported a lot nowadays, in particular with major clinical trials, not just in the field of EP, but also in the field of intervention and heart failure. And sometimes it can get a bit too fixated in terms of the p-value. I mean, it is a very sort of useful sort of number to look at, but we also need to look at the treatment effect, the differences between the two, or even perhaps more arms being compared, and the treatment effect size, as we call it. And I guess, along with that, we need to also consider how the study was designed and how they derive their methodology, sample sizing, whether the findings from the study supports the results and the way the study is designed, and whether that p-value should be applicable to that. So yeah, I think all these things need to be considered together and not just being focused on the p-value per se. I think
the overall effect size is quite important parameter to look at.
Yeah, I agree that. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have more time to discuss any
so 2 more minutes maybe. Once again, Anil, you can carry on, but I'll just see if Dr. Kerkar is once again here, because he is a great fan of statistics. Dr. Kerkar?
Sure.
Yeah? No, I think is not easily there. So Anil, you can take it further if there is something.
Yeah, I think we can move on to the next presentation.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Dr. Chiang. Great pleasure to have
you very much.
Well done. And good discussion. Thank you, Dr. Saxena. We move on to the last, and I'll just call it a lively segment because Professor Wilder has thankfully consented to be on our meeting for the second time successively in the 2 years, and he's going to do it live. So once again, to introduce Professor Wilder, he's the head of the Laboratory of Experimental Cardiology and head of the Department of Clinical and Experimental Cardiology, Academic Medical Center, Amsterdam. He's an authority on genetics testing for inherited arrhythmias and cardiomyopathies, and it is should I say in Dutch, onze groot plezier om u hier te hebben. Dr. K.K. Talwar, Professor Talwar is the IHRS patron who is the moderator for this session. And Professor Will, the floor is yours.
Can you disable the screen? Can you allow me to?
Yeah, you could share the screen, yeah.
Not yet. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for your kind introduction and your beautiful Dutch. And it's a pity that I cannot do this in your language. Anyway, you asked me to speak about the genetic testing for inherited arrhythmias and cardiomyopathies and discuss the opportunities and the challenges. So my name is Arthur Wilde, and I'm living and working in Amsterdam. I'm working in the Amsterdam University Medical Centers. The state of art of this domain, so genetic testing for channelopathies and cardiomyopathies, was discussed and written down in a consensus statement by the Heart Rhythm Society and the European Heart Rhythm Association in 2011. This was chaired by Dr. Ackerman and Dr. Priori. And at that time, the table for genetic testing of these diseases is, the summary is here. You can do genetic testing for diagnostic purposes, for prognostic purposes, or for therapeutic purposes. And when there are 3 pluses, it means that there is a clear indication to do it for diagnostic purposes, like here in the long QT syndrome and in CPVT. For prognostic reasons, it was important at that time in long QT syndrome, and for therapeutic reason, a little bit less, but still also very relevant. But as you can see, there are still many diseases, for example, here atrial fibrillation, where genetic testing has no impact on the diagnosis, on the prognosis, nor on the therapeutics. And also for some of the cardiomyopathies, it was not that well established at that time. Now, currently, we are working at an update of this document, and this is now organized by the European Heart Rhythm Association, but also together with the Heart Rhythm Society in the US, and also importantly for where you are, by the Asian Pacific Heart Rhythm Society and the Latin American Heart Rhythm Society. This document is in preparation, and it is expected in March 22 at the European Heart Rhythm Association meeting in Copenhagen. Now, if you have a gene, an arrhythmia, a disease, an arrhythmia or a cardiomyopathy, you might be able to identify the gene and then do functional studies. You have the protein structure and the function. You can do it in cell systems, and you can do it in the whole organ or the whole animal. And that ultimately may lead to gene-specific therapy or new therapy. But importantly for today, the identification of the gene also enables prediction and prevention of further events in the affected families. And we studied that over many years. We started with this in 1996. And this is a report in 2011, was published in 2013, and our first 15 years of experience. And this is the yield of molecular diagnosis, genetic testing in primary electrical disease, so the long QT syndrome and CPVT and Brugada syndrome. And as you can see with sound cases, the yield overall in these 15 years is about 50%. For CPVT, it's only 40%, and for Brugada syndrome, it is 30%. It makes a difference whether you are dealing with a family or a positive family history, and that is defined as having more than one person in the family clearly affected, or with similar with the typical complaints of the same disease. But we included under the definition of a positive family history also a sudden cardiac death under the age of 40 of a first, second, or third degree relative. And if you then discriminate between cases with a positive family history and cases with a negative family history, so an isolated case, the yield is obviously much higher in those cases with a positive family history. In the long QT syndrome, it's over 80%. In CPVT, also in Brugada syndrome, it's over 40%. But also in isolated cases, it's still worthwhile pursuing because for long QT syndrome in an isolated case is still 30% yield, and for Brugada syndrome it's 20%, and for CPVT it's around 10%. And for the cardiomyopathies, the yield is here. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy close to 50%, DCM 30%, but this was before Titin was in the panels, and Titin contributes at least 25%, so by now it's also over 50%, and ARVC was close to 40%. Now, by doing this screening, you will identify individuals with the genetic defect who have been asymptomatic their whole life, and then all of a sudden you identify them as being a carrier of a gene. And the question then is pertinent: does that indeed lead to prophylactic treatment? We studied that in our population in long QT patients, in CPVT patients, and in Brugada syndrome patients. And we addressed the question: what is the follow-up status in terms of treatment after 3 to 4 years? The follow-up of these patients was 3 to 4 years. And as you can see here, these patients, all asymptomatic at the time you identified them. The vast majority of long QT patients and of CPVT patients was treated with beta blockers mostly, and an occasional patient with Brugada syndrome did get a prophylactic ICD. So it is useful to do the screening because it leads to prophylactic treatment. Now, I showed this before. This is the 2011 summary of the state of the field. And in 2022, this will be what will be added as far as therapeutics is concerned. I didn't add the extras for diagnostic and prognostic reasons. But for the long QT syndrome, we now believe that it is full evidence that also for therapeutic reasons, it is important to know the underlying genotype. For CPVT, that is partly the case. For Brugada syndrome, that's partly the case. For short QT syndrome, that's partly the case. And certainly for ACM or ARVC, that's certainly the case. So there will be changes as is to be expected in the 2022 document. Now, what are actually the problems of genetic testing? So I discussed the opportunities and the reasons to do it, but there's obviously a backside of the same coin. First of all, there is the phenotype interpretation, which is not always easy. And as I will show later, if you start with a messy phenotype, you will end up with a messy genotype. I'm not going to discuss this in detail because of the lack of time. Gene interpretation, I will discuss, and the most difficult issue here is variant interpretation. So I'll start with gene interpretation. And this is what happened over time. In 1995, when this field started, the electrical field here, the long QT syndrome, the first 2 genes were identified in 1995. And in the course of 23 years, in 2018, there were 17 genes associated with long QT syndrome. In Brugada syndrome, it were over 20 genes, and catecholamine-induced polymorphic VT, it was 10. And you can go down the list, 1, 4, 7, 2 in these different disorders. There has been a great attempt by ClinGen. ClinGen is an American organization with interest in this field. And they actually followed a very strict algorithm to determine whether the genes that have been associated are really associated. And as you can see, quite a few dropped from that list, are now no longer considered associated with the disease and downgraded to at most limited or even disputed evidence. So now we think that the long QT syndrome has 8 sound genes. In Brugada syndrome, it's even more dramatic. It's only SCN5A, which passed that stringent algorithm. In catecholamine-induced polymorphic VT, there are 7 gene less. The question marks refer to the fact that these diseases have not been curated yet. And for short QT syndrome, the 7 have been rolled down to 4. And the same happened in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and dilated cardiomyopathy and ACM. And these are the different papers published in Circulation and Circulation Genomic Precision Medicine. And the very same pattern was seen here from the many genes initially associated with either disease. Only a handful or up to 10 left are still there. So the genes that used to be associated with particular diseases are now no longer associated, and that has obviously impact for genetic testing. Variant interpretation is even a more difficult issue. And one may ask the question, why not test all individuals with a certain hint of a phenotype? That is actually this particular problem, the variant of unknown significance. And that is really a big issue in this field. And as I mentioned already, a messy phenotype leads to a messy genetic result. So this paper from 2014 is a good example of what the yield is of genetic testing. This is the example of genetic variation in dilated cardiomyopathy. And what they did is they followed their results over time. In the early days, they studied 5 genes, 556 cases with 5 genes screened. And over time, the number of genes increased from 5 to 10, from 10 to 19, to 24, to 46. And these are a custom panel that is in use, that was in use in 2014. Nowadays, it's well over 100 genes. And this is what you actually find. So the positive result, which is a clear pathogenic mutation, is in red here. So with an increased number of genes, you do find an increased number of positive results, but it increases from, let's say, 5 to 10% to a little over 20%. The negative results drop significantly, but the problem is the black line here, that is the inconclusive result. So that is a variant of unknown significance. With a few genes, the genes that were most likely to be strongly associated, you do not find that many fusses, inconclusive results. But if you increase the number of genes, you significantly and dramatically, I would say, increase the number of variants of unknown significance. So in 6 out of 10 patients, you find a variant of unknown significance, and that is an inconclusive result. Is that a problem? Yes, that is a problem, because variants of unknown significance leads to unnecessary concern, leads to unnecessary treatment, and may lead to unnecessary relief. And this is particularly the case if the family started with a sudden death, and if in the sudden death case you find a variant of unknown significance, it's just one step away from testing that variant in remaining family members, and then having the variant may lead to unnecessary concern, not having the variant may lead to unnecessary relief, and it may lead to unnecessary treatment. The next 2 slides are actually a good example of this unnecessary treatment. This is in 2016, so that's not that long ago. In the Wall Street Journal, a study was reported, or this was a study from the Mayo Clinics, and the Wall Street Journal picked it up because in this 13-year-old boy's sudden cardiac death led doctors to wrongly diagnose more than 20 of his relatives with a potential lethal heart disorder, in a case that illustrates the potential for genetic testing to go wrong. So this case led to misuse of genetic tests. And then if you just read this bottom line, this is from Michael Ackerman from the Mayo Clinics. The search for a genetic cause of the teenager's death was done with good intention, said Michael Ackerman. But the entire clinical evaluation was a train wreck where wrong conclusions led to wrong turns and resulted in wrong therapies. So it can really be dangerous to do genetic testing and then subsequently do the wrong thing. I'll give you an example that interpretation is difficult. This is from the group of Dan Roden in Nashville, in Tennessee, published in JAMA in 2016 also. And what they did is they have here almost a little over 2,000 individuals in 7 sites, and they have the sequence data of these individuals. These were just regular patients, not particular patients with an inherited cardiac disease, but patients that come into the hospital. they have sequence data, and they were interested in the pharmacogenes. And these are 84 genes, and among them are SCN5A and KCNH2. So this is the cardiac sodium channel and one of the potassium channels that is relevant in the heart. This is responsible for LQT2. This is responsible for LQT3. I only showed you the results of SCN5A. So what they found in these 2,000 individuals is a variant in orange that is declared pathogenic by one company. They checked the result in 4 different companies. These are formal companies that offer genetic testing in the United States. And out of these, I think these are 35 variants, the orange ones were declared pathogenic by at least one company. So these are the different variants. And this is the different companies. ClinVar is what you find on the internet. There is a laboratory 1, 2, and 3. So these are officially laboratories offering genetic tests. And for example, this genetic variant was found pathogenic only by laboratory 1 and not by 2 and 3. And from these whole list of 35 variants, there are actually only 2 that are they have consistent results throughout the companies. And then if you couple these data with the phenotype, so with the data from the electronic medical record, then only one patient out of these 2 had a phenotype. So if you think about this, this actually means that, first of all, it matters where you do the genetic test, whether it comes back as a variant of importance or not. And secondly, if you find it, in this case, in a control individual, it doesn't really mean that the patient has actually a phenotype. So you may question at all what is found here. So that brings me to the conclusion that genetic testing in inherited arrhythmia syndromes definitely has a significant yield. It has impact on surviving family members, and it should be performed in a multidisciplinary setting and in experienced hands. And the reason for the last 2 is this issue of variant of no unknown significance. Please be aware that not all published genes are causally involved, and genetic results can be downgraded or upgraded, and there is a large yield of variants of unknown significance, and that may lead to great problems in the interpretation and the management of your patients. And once again, a messy phenotype leads to messy genetic results, which means that you should do, first of all, only genetic testing in strong cases. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Bilder, for this masterly presentation, and I think sharing with us the genetics in both channelopathy as well as cardiomyopathies. And I'm sure this is a field with us also in infancy, but I'm sure this decade is going to be a decade of genetics and molecular medicine and cardiology. I'd like to ask you just one question before we request others, that as far as cardiomyopathy, you know what I mean, in arrhythmias, there are certain group, I think still they're useful and both for prognosis as well as therapeutic interventions. In cardiomyopathy, particularly dilated cardiomyopathy, do you have any kind of, at the moment, any suggestion which cases should be studied? Or I think still it is a more of a experiment?
And you're particularly referring to dilated cardiomyopathy, is that what I understood?
Yes, sir. Yes. That's right.
Yeah, so I think in dilated cardiomyopathy, the cases that you should definitely study if there is a young person or a person with a family history of sudden death or other cardiomyopathies in the same family. And young would be defined, let's say, under the age of 50. And of course, the prerequisite to start genetic testing is there should be no other cause for the cardiomyopathy, no ischemic heart disease, no hypertension, no tachycardiomyopathy. What can you have? So young cases under the age of 50 with a severe cardiomyopathy, cases with the combination of dilated cardiomyopathy and conduction disease, and cases with a strong family history or with a family history. And the reason for that is that you have a fairly good chance that you find particular genes as the substrate for the disease that have, and the finding of such genes may have impact on the management. There are particular genes that have a very malignant cause in terms of high chance of arrhythmias. For example, lamin AC is one of them. Phospholambam is another one of them. And FLNC, if you find one of these genes, your patient has a high risk for a lethal arrhythmia. And that might lead to an early ICD implant, which is much earlier than you would do otherwise if the cardiomyopathy is based on something else. So, but in the elderly, if you're referring to the elderly, well, over 60, without a family history, we do not do genetic testing on a standard basis also.
I think it's more relevant for the younger people. But question is, I think you also briefly mentioned the interpretation of the results, because many companies do come out, we can do genetic studies, but I think having expertise in interpretation is probably also a major factor. I think there is a question on the chat box I'd like to front up. How do I go about a 15 years old asymptomatic normal ECG and normal echo, son of a Brugada syndrome with type 1 ECG, received appropriate BF therapy from ICD?
How do I go about 15 years old asymptomatic normal?
Anyway, I think
the patient is the father is a Brugada syndrome patient with a type 1 EKG and received appropriate VF therapy. Well, I would screen the father. The father is the one who should undergo genetic testing. And if you find an SCN5A variant, that it's most likely pathogenic, then you can screen the 15-year-old asymptomatic with a normal EKG, and you can either discharge him or he should then be followed up. At this age, even if you are a carrier of a pathogenic variant, not necessarily the patient already shows the type 1 EKG that might develop over life. So discharge can only be done if you have a negative genetic test when the father is positive.
I'd like to just share with you one of the observations from our own, in the country data which was published long time back in Circulation of Genetic Studies in DCM. What we saw was that 25 base pairs deletion in intron 32, cardiac myosin binding protein C, it was seen that this as was such is prevalent in 4% of South Indians, and probably was not seen in other ethnic group. And there was an increased risk of heart failure with odd ratio of around 7. Those who had this kind of a genetic sort of result, they had a chances that over a period of they may go into heart failure.
Yeah, I'm aware of that paper, and that's a very important paper because it shows that you have a predisposition for external factors related dilated cardiomyopathy, like hypertension. So if you are aware of that, then in that particular part of the country, I would, if you have a patient with hypertension, you probably treat every patient with hypertension. But you might even be more strict in patients who carry this particular variant. And if the prevalence is so high, and you have demonstrated that hypertension may lead to severe cardiomyopathy in patients with carrying this variant, then you would screen these individuals and treat them more aggressively, because I assume that without the hypertension, they will not develop the dilated cardiomyopathy. The importance of the study mainly lies in the fact that it shows that external factors modify the phenotype, but the basis for the disease is in this case this particular variant.
I think one, what about the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy? Which cases you think that all patients should be subjected to genetic studies or any particular group? Because I think the interpretation also is an issue. So I'd like to hear from you about the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy.
Yeah, so hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is more or less similar, I believe, as dilated cardiomyopathy. The number of genes is less. There were many, but it has been brought down essentially to the sarcomeric genes. So there are about 10 genes left, I believe. And these genes, if you have a clear case of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, so increased septal thickness, once again in a young individual, or with a family history of sudden death or family history of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, that is a clear case where you could do genetic testing. In hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, it does not really impact on treatment yet, because it doesn't really make a difference whether you have one gene or the other gene in terms of prognosis nor in terms of treatment. That might change with these new developments of new drugs. Some of these drugs might be more relevant for patients with myosin binding protein C, other maybe more for the heavy chain gene. But that's too early to tell. So I would also, and that's what we do, we screen young individuals with a clear phenotype and or with a clear family history. The elderly with this abnormal septum just below the aortic valve, that is the population, if there is no family history, where you are not going to find a high yield. So you probably better not screen there.
There's one question from on the chat box. How exactly does genetic testing determine treatment in ACM, or ARBC?
Yeah, that is more or less the same answer as I already. ACM, arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy, are these forms of dilated cardiomyopathy that present with arrhythmias first, which means that the arrhythmic substrate is already there before there is a clear cardiomyopathy, and you better identify these patients early. This is once again Lamin AC, phospholamban, FLNC. These genes usually present with an arrhythmia substrate first before they have a clear cardiomyopathy, and later on they develop the cardiomyopathy. And so their genetic testing mainly will find the patients with a high risk of significant arrhythmias. I can read the chat. Is that okay? The next question in the chat?
Yeah, there are two more questions. I think it's good to. Should I read?
No,
please go ahead.
The first is sudden cardiac death in young with normal heart who was asymptomatic, had undergone recently routine tests, normal result. Does genetic testing of family members advised? I think the answer should be no. If you consider genetic testing, you first do it in the individual who died, but the yield is rather low. It's in the order of 10 to 15%. And what we do advise is screening, cardiological screening. So you still make an EKG, you make an exercise test, you make an echo in the surviving family members. Because it can still be that the individual who died had a subthreshold phenotype, whereas the QT interval in his brother or sister may be markedly prolonged. So there is a good reason to do clinical screening. And only when clinical screening identifies something that is of relevance, then you can proceed with genetic screening. What is the role of genetic testing in persons with strong family history of sudden cardiac death? Actually, that's the same answer. So there is a clear role for clinical screening, and when there is in the clinical screening, you find something of importance, then you can proceed with genetic screening.
I think as far as we are nearing time, and Dr. Ashish, to be close, or you can have more questions?
Yeah, sure. Maybe one last one before we leave, Dr. Wilder. Is anything known about genetics in Marfan syndrome?
Yeah, Marfan syndrome has also a clear heterogeneous genetic basis. So that means that there are many genes involved. I think about between 10 and 15 different genes, and some are more prevalent than others. But there is a definite role for genetic testing. I'm not aware though that it has impact on treatment choices. But it is true, for example, in all these aortopathies, if there is a genetic basis, then, for example, the surgery, prophylactic surgery, is done at an earlier stage than if you have an isolated case. So it makes a difference whether you are a familiar case, but I don't think the particular gene is of relevance there.
Especially just I mean, what do you think the future of genetic therapy in these kind of disorders? I mean, how soon you think this knowledge will translate into a?
It's a very interesting question, and it's a challenging topic. I've always been, my personal belief, I've always been quite pessimistic about the role of gene therapy in the ion channel diseases, because the difficulty and the hurdle to take in all this gene therapy is how do you get the gene, the construct, in the heart. And if you don't bring it in a homogeneous way to the heart, I think if you're dealing with ion channels, you bring the patients in trouble. In cardiomyopathies, it may be different because there's no need to do it homogeneous. So in particularly in these lamin AC and phospholambam, gene therapy may not be that far away. Let's say it will still be 10 years, but it's a foreseeable future.
Okay, Ashish, over to you. I think we are
sure. No, we are certainly at the end of our scheduled time. Thanks, Professor Wilde, for
great pleasure
being with us. It's a great pleasure to have you one more time, and I'm sure everybody wants to probably have a workshop here on genetics to learn more. It cannot be completed in half an hour. So it's a great pleasure to have you. Thanks so much. So
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So this is really bye-bye.
Ashish, I must say todzins to Professor Wilde.
Sure.
Thank you very well. Very good. Bye-bye.
I think it has been a sort of great learning. This is one area, I think there's so much knowledge coming, but listening from a master and what is the precise status.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Professor Wilde.
Sure.
I hope to be able to come to India once more.
You need to.
Now,
Correct.
Bye-bye.
Correct. Sometime in your future. Bye-bye. So surely we are closing this session today. One of the second in the series of our pre-conference workshops. Great pleasure to have Professor Wilde, Dr. Chiang, and Dr. John Mandrola discussing different topics. Also, I must thank Dr. Lokhandwala and Dr. Saxena for having a very lively discussion. We surely will close this session, but not before I remind the whole IHRS community and the 2,000 plus delegates to join us on Friday at 13th. My sincere request to keep your time free, because the clinical work has started increasing for everybody, and you need to delegate your work to somebody and be there for the digital IHRS 2021. It's going to run in 4 theaters. And you will be spoiled for choice what to attend. But be there for one of those sessions so that the rest can, of course, be seen as pre-recorded. But be there 13 hours on 17th December, Friday. I hope to see you there on behalf of the organizing president, Professor Prafulla Kerkar, and the chairman of the scientific committee, Dr. Yash Lokhandwala. I invite you to the digital IHRS 2021. Bye-bye. Good night. See ya.
Good night. Good night, Ashish. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you so much.
Good night. Bye.